Hello everyone. Welcome to the Martin School. My name is Charles Godfrey. I'm the director. And welcome to the second of three events that we're having in parallel with the IPBES Plenary meeting at the moment. That's the International Panel of Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, which met last week, or the week before, in Manchester. And it produced a report on biodiversity in business. And in this event, we're talking about measuring what matters, how science can help business deal with biodiversity. And I'm now going to hand over to the Master of Ceremonies for today, Nat Seddon, who is Professor of Biodiversity and also leads the Agile program in the Martin School. Nat, over to you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this very rainy afternoon for this panel on measuring what matters. This conversation, as I'm sure you're all very much aware, and as Charles alluded to, sits in the slipstream of a major science to policy moment. The new summary for policymakers of the IPBES 16 assessment for business and biodiversity just was released only yesterday after a lot of discussions, which many of you, in fact I know that many of you were there last week in Manchester. Now, three very high-level signals from that assessment frame today's discussion. And none of this will be news, but I think it's good to sort of remind us and get us foreground the discussion with these three signals. First of all, the assessment makes it explicit that biodiversity loss is now a systemic economic and financial risk. Nature is not peripheral to the economy. It is the living, dynamic, evolving operating system that sits beneath it and of which we are an integral and vital part. Second, finance remains profoundly misaligned with planetary stability. That could not be a biggest understatement I think I've ever made. The capital driving degradation still completely dwarfs the capital marginally supporting its regeneration by an order of magnitude. So the assessment talks about a figure of $7.2 trillion a year going into activities that harm the biosphere and the climate system versus a mere 200 billion going into regenerative activities. And there's quite a lot of debate as to whether that 200 billion might in fact be an overstatement. This isn't really a measurement gap at all. It's very much an incentives and governance gap, or ones that are very relevant to the science, which is why what we're looking at today. And the third key take-home relevant to this discussion is that technology around measurement is proliferating much faster than our understanding. So we now have the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosure, the Science-Based Targets Initiative, many different national indicator sets, voluntary credit methodologies, the list goes on, and yet fewer than 1% of companies disclose any meaningful biodiversity information. And so without deep clarity on what truly matters, these metrics risk becoming noise. It's a blizzard of metrics, or worse, actually reinforcing the extractive dynamics of the root cause of all the challenges that we face. So, the session asks four very practical questions, scientific, but also very ethical and political. First of all, what should we measure, and who gets to decide what matters? Secondly, how can measurement avoid the extractive dynamics? What matters for whom? And how do models and indicators support rather than distract from solutions on the ground? And finally, how can science help align the private and the public finances with genuinely nature-positive trajectories? So to navigate this very complex and extremely important terrain, we have this really exceptional panel, and we're so grateful at the Oxford Martin School that they have found time in their very busy lives to come and be with us today to discuss this issue. And their expertise spans frontier science, synthesis and modelling, real-world corporate uptake, and government decision-making. So I'm going to give brief bios now, and then we'll start with a short round of interventions from each panellist before moving on to a moderated discussion and questions. But Professor Kate Jones is Professor of Ecology and Biodiversity at UCL. She is the charismatic lead of the People and Nature Lab, and is very much a leading voice on scalable biodiversity monitoring, right at the cutting edge, especially on bioacoustics and AI-enabled ecological inference. Mark Blackster is head of program for the Tree of Life at the Wellcome Sanger Institute, is a pioneer of biodiversity genomics and the central architect of the Darwin Tree of Life effort, building genomic baselines that could really transform biodiversity assessment and traceability. Professor Andy Purvis is a research leader at the Natural History Museum and professor at Imperial College, and is a global authority on biodiversity indicators and modelling, leading work including the Biodiversity Intactness Index, and pushing the robustness of metrics used, the frontier of the robustness of metrics used in policy and business. Elizabeth Boakes is conservation scientist at the RSPB, who really works at the sharp end of biodiversity data gaps and what organisations, what businesses in particular, actually do with the metrics, bringing particular insight into the realities of corporate uptake, including through the Task Force for Nature-related Financial Disclosure-related work. And we have Professor Anjali Goswami, who is research lead at the Natural History Museum and Chief Scientific Advisor and Director for Science, Data and Analyst at DEFRA. And she really bridges frontier research with public decision making and highlighting what the government needs for metrics to track outcomes, not just activities. So I'm going to sit down now, and I want to go first of all to Kate with the first question. So these questions are all really easy. Some questions that we thought would be good to start with this one. So, if a business or investor asked you for one biodiversity, oh yeah, thank you. It's used to speaking without it. So. Hopefully that's clear. Yeah, great. If a business or investor asked you for one biodiversity signal that is both scalable and genuinely decision relevant, sort of beyond sort of species counts, what would you prioritise? And also, could you reflect somewhat on the sort of the biggest inference traps when we use things like AI and bioacoustics and remote sensing at scale?
So thank you very much for the invitation, and I'm not sure I'm thanking you for the question because it's really hard. So in order to answer that question, just back up a bit. What is biodiversity? And I think we need to understand a bit about, what is it that that reflects in order to think about how to measure it. So often people talk about, species, where species are, so presence and absence, or it's the number of different individuals within a species, or it's their interactions between each other that's important, or it's the genetic diversity of those species or individuals. So biodiversity is really complex, and there's not one measure that would capture all of that. So that's a really impossible question to answer. And I want to kind of just take a moment to reflect on the massive revolution we've seen over the last few years on the amount of sensing which can be conducted. So the amount of new sensors, which are exponentially increasing every day, that we're in a kind of I never thought I'd say this as a biodiversity scientist, but there's too much data. So we have acoustic sensors, which are tiny, acoustic sensors which can do AI on the sensor, edge processing. We can apply AI on the sensor to do bird counts, bat counts, frog counts. We can look from the sky and use LiDAR and remote sensing, like satellite data, really fine scale. We can process that data to an extent that I never even thought would be possible a few years ago. We can look at DNA from the air. We can, if we had a sensor here, we would pull out all of you that are in this room, which is really scary. We can look at camera traps in the wild. We can, there are collars around animals, tiny tags on bees, monitor them from the space station. There's so many things that we can do. I think that is causing another problem, is that how do we analyze those data? How do we turn the data to information? And so I think that kind of comes to my point, which is, we have all these AI tools which can kind of process these data now to an amazing degree. So we can, from the sound that species make, we can tell what species they are to a certain extent. We can process millions of images from camera traps all over the world, and so we can get reports about, you know, what species are present and you know, how to analyse those in a way which I never dreamed possible. So I think the question is now is not about whether we have the data, but how do we turn that data into information? And I think the question that we need to ask now is, and I would ask to a business, is, and this is really boring and annoying, and I'm really sorry, but what's your question? Like, what are you actually trying to achieve with your monitoring? And to misquote the late and great Georgina Mace, I would say, what's your theory of change? Like, what is it that you actually are trying to do? Are those things that you're measuring, are they measuring the inputs that you're putting into the system? So the inputs would be, say, how many sensors you put out, or the outputs, how many you know, bits of data you've collected, or is it the outcomes, like the actual question that you're interested in? And I think that's really hard to scale in a meaningful way. And I feel that you know, addressing that and challenging businesses to ask what they're actually interested in measuring. And your second question was around what are the pitfalls of AI, and you know, we spend the entire time talking about that, but I would say there's a really big ethical dimension that we need to address. We need to think about how we use these really, really, really powerful tools in a responsible way. And I would say that, you know, when I'm asked to do, say, big biodiversity surveys of the tropics or areas which have got really high biodiversity, it's a massive challenge because we don't have the kind of libraries of information about those species which are present to train some of these algorithms. Now, some of these algorithms are getting so clever now, you can do agile modelling. So that means you use a foundational model, like a big model of birds, say BirdNet, for example, or the Merlin app on your phone if people have those. And then you can tweak it at the end to add a few examples from the species that you want. So these things are getting more and more powerful as we go on. But I think, you know, rare species, the species we're really interested in, we've got terrible records of. So using an AI for those is going to be tricky. So it's about having, you know, real data to use some of these algorithms on and really be very cautious in who's using them, who's got control of them, and what are the kind of, you know, what are the policies around, you know, publishing them and who's got control. Else you're just kind of transferring another type of coloniality into biodiversity monitoring. So I think I'm really hopeful about what we can come up with, but I would throw back that answer to the business and ask them, what is it that you actually want to know? And is it what intervention is it that you're trying to achieve, you're trying to understand? Or you know, businesses work on, you know, what they think you know, measurable outcomes, and I think that's really hard for many of these metrics.
Thanks so much. No, it's a great overview of some of the technology, and it is mind-blowing where we're at now in terms of monitoring and data, and staying in that, and of course everything's very place-based, which of course adds all that extra layers of complexity. So thanks for that. But sort of staying with the sort of the technology, as it were, can we talk a little bit to you, Mark, about where we're at with genomics and eDNA? People get very, very excited about this, but what does a good baseline look like when it comes to, say, genomic information? And are we anywhere near a kind of decision-ready tool that draws upon that kind of data?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I don't think we're near, but I can see ways of getting near. One of the things that excites me about life on this planet is we're all connected by a common thread, and the common thread is DNA. And all our DNA tells us about not only ourselves being part of Homo sapiens, but also who our parents were and who our grandparents. And so it also keeps a trace of the population we're part of. And so one of the things that I'm really excited by, I'm a genome biologist. If you show me anything, I think, can we sequence it? It's like a carpenter and a hammer, everything looks like a nail. But one of the things we can get just by sequencing one genome for each species is not only a snapshot of what that species can do. You can see all the enzymes and other biology it can do, but you also get an idea about its place in nature, so its place in the evolutionary tree of life, but also a record of its local recent history. So that individual had parents and grandparents and so on, And we can estimate, in fact, how big the pool of organisms is that that individual is a representative of. So we can use it to estimate how big the population is. And that's really important for biodiversity assessment because it gives us a way, just by sampling very few individuals, not having to see them all, capture them on camera traps. I work on nematodes, mostly. Nematodes very rarely feature in camera traps because they're a millimetre long and live in the soil. So this allows us to actually capture information about the population history and local dynamics of species in an area in a way which is rich in terms of data and very informative. What we don't have yet is a way of really tying that in with conservation outcomes or intervention outcomes, because very few places have genomic data going back far enough that we can say this intervention had an effect. If you look at something that does fit in camera traps, so the cheetahs in Africa, it's very clear they're very inbred, and so we would get that from sequencing the genome, even if we didn't know it beforehand. And then so we can say, well, if we have that idea from a cheetah, we know that this sort of intervention is needed there. We can look at another species and say, from this genome, we can say that this population is and has been very inbred for some time. Therefore, this kind of intervention probably should happen. So for me, that's something that whole genome data gives. We started the Darwin Tree of Life project 6 years ago, and at that point, it cost us about £30,000 to £50,000 per genome to get a genome sequence. Scary amount of money, given that for Darwin Tree of Life project, which is focused on Britain and Ireland, there are about 70,000 species in Britain and Ireland. 50,000 times 70,000 equals, no, you're not getting that much money. Last year, we were sequencing genomes at £3,000 per genome, and it's coming down and down. So we can now do that kind of reference genome sequencing. £3,000 is still a lot, but it's getting cheaper and cheaper. So very soon, it'll be a simple thing. Well, it's a simple thing to do now, just it'll cost less and less. The other thing that this common thread gives us is that all of us share genes with bananas, famously, right? And that's because we have a common ancestor. And we can look at some genes in us and in bananas and many other things and use them a bit like DNA, a bit like barcodes that you use to identify things in a supermarket. So it's possible to choose a piece of the genome, which is common across all animal life, for example, and sequence that. And just from that short piece of sequence, so our genome is 3 billion base pairs, and we're talking about sequencing 600 base pairs. From that 600 base pair sequence, place me and everybody else in this room in the place in the tree. Doesn't give us any deep information, but it definitely places us in the tree. And you can do that on an ecological scale. So you can do that using single specimen-based barcoding. So there's an organization called the International Barcode of Life. They run a huge database. It's based in Canada, but it has data coming in from all over the world, which is specimen-based barcoding, where you have a specimen, you generate the 600 base pairs of data, and you put it in the database. They have 15 million records, corresponding to just under 1.7 million species. So there only are 1.7 million species of eukaryotes described so far. So they expect to get to something like 4 million described species very soon, or barcoded species very soon. So they're describing a whole bunch of new species. So that's a huge global database which you can access. And that's available to monitor any individual species, presence or absence, but also ecosystems. And so in the Sanger Institute, Mara Lonizak, who I work with, has been running something called UK Bioscan, which is taking single insects from 100 sites around the UK. And she's now sequenced 400,000 of those and has identified 11,000 flying insects. And this is a project which happens in the same 100 sites every month, all through the year. So it's been running for 3 years now. And so that's going to give us ecosystem information about presence, absence of individual species in those ecosystems. Gives us seasonal information. That is really cheap. That's pennies per insect. And so that sort of DNA barcoding mechanism, where we have a huge reference library, which isn't complete yet, is a much quicker way of getting DNA sequence into an ecological assessment process.
Brilliant. So trajectory towards greater accessibility of this in a very short period of time. Thank you. Well, we'll come back to some of those things that you raised, but let's zoom out for the next question. Andy, just if you had to, if we need to, and sometimes it feels like this is the question in the biodiversity science community, if we needed to converge on a sensible set, ideally a small set of biodiversity dimensions that policy and finance could act upon, you know, what would they be from your perspective, and what's it going to take to earn the scientific trust in those?
Cheers. Thanks for that. No, it's a great question. So I'll start just with a simple thought experiment to rebut the notion that it might be one dimension, that there could be a single measure. So two things are both bad if they happen. Extinction of species globally, we want to minimize that because it's a shame. And ecosystems no longer functioning, and we want to minimize that because we depend on them functioning. So, you know, our quality of life, duration of life will suffer if ecosystems stop functioning. Okay, so surely there's a measure that you can use for both of those things, except, little thought experiment, if all of the critically endangered species that there are now went extinct overnight, ecosystems would keep functioning because those critically endangered species are ecologically not having very much impact, and they're also found in only tiny fractions of the world. So all of our managed ecosystems would not notice their absence. But it would still be a tragedy, right? Whereas, conversely, without losing any species, reduce the abundance of everything by 25% overnight, and all our supply chains fall to pieces immediately. And it's a catastrophic ecological recession. But we haven't lost any species. So my sort of beginning point to the answer is there's at least these two dimensions. There's something about global extinction. We want to have an accurate handle on that and how it responds to different policies, different actions that we might do, because we have a duty, I would argue, to maintain those threads that Mark was talking about and keep our relatives in the game, right? And future generations may depend on the survival of those relatives, even if we don't. But then we also are going to need some measure of, loosely, ecosystem health, ecosystems' ability to produce ecosystem services if they are asked to. So a lot of ecosystem services, like food, are kind of co-produced between the biodiversity in ecosystems and human inputs as well, right? But what we're seeing increasingly in agricultural land is that nature is bringing less and less to that party, and so agrochemical inputs and management are having to increase because nature's ability, its potential to deliver the ecosystem services without those inputs is falling and falling and falling because we're over-exploiting the resource that's there. So we need something that's ecosystem health on average, and there are these categories of ecosystem service like food and feed and materials which you can relatively easily market and kind of capture the profit from those. And David Obura, who spoke here a couple of weeks ago, was making the point that actually focusing a lot on those is what's got us into the mess we're in at the moment. So you could probably unpick the mechanisms behind the production of those and work out what to monitor. But we also need the regulating and the non-material ecosystem services too. And that's why a broad measure of ecosystem health that might be very specific to the kind of ecosystem. So Kate leads a project, Biome Health Initiative, which is trying to identify what the measures might be for different kinds of ecosystem. My own group, we produce the Biodiversity Intactness Index, which is trying to be an estimate of ecosystem health, because we do know from biodiversity ecosystem function work that as you remove biodiversity from ecosystems, the average rate of ecosystem functions and processes tends to go down, the variance increases, and it's an accelerating curve suggesting you can lose quite a lot before you lose function, but when you start considering the whole range of things we get from ecosystems, then that becomes more linear. Never completely linear, but it's heading in that direction. So something around how much of the natural biodiversity still remains is, I'd argue, that's a useful one too. But those two things, that and extinction, they're very different. They're at different scales. We need them for different reasons, and you can't find a currency conversion between them.
Thank you very much. That's very clear. Sometimes it feels we're awash with indicators, and so that's you've made it sound very simple, which is great. Just a very short, small follow-on question around, you're often saying we really do need to do a better job of systematically validating our models with data. But where's the weaknesses in the sense? Is it the data? Is it the models? Is it the way or our culture of validation? Or is it a mixture of all of the above?
It's a great question. It's all of them.
Okay.
It's across the whole piece. I'd say we're 3 to 4 decades behind climate models, and that's a shame because it's also harder. Because you made the point that place specific, whereas carbon emission doesn't matter where it is, and greenhouse gas emission is kind of the only thing you need to worry about with climate models, and with biodiversity models it's loads. So if you look at the essential climate variables, you can see the different states of maturity, in that there are the measures of state, like temperature, and of drivers, like greenhouse gas concentrations, whereas the essential biodiversity variables tend to have been put together by biodiversity scientists saying, oh, what are the things that we tend to measure and work with and analyse? So they're all measures of biodiversity, and they're not drivers, which are obviously a really important part of it. And then another thing that shows how far behind we are, now I admit I haven't seen the evidence underpinning it, but Mark Urban published an estimate that the cost, well, the spend annually on climate models globally is about $4 billion. It's not that for biodiversity modelling, no matter what my brother may think. Hi, Martin, if you're watching.
Yes, of course, Kate.
I completely agree with that, but I would say there are some rays of hope. So I've been working on some ecosystem models for marine systems. I was like, what is she doing that? But it's been really fascinating, and these models have come out of the fisheries markets, basically, and they're becoming more and more sophisticated and linking ecosystems and biodiversity along kind of energy biomass flows and sinks, and this is really fascinating because you can then start to put human economic markets into those decisions, and so then you start to have a people and a nature type of ecosystem management. And I think a number of organisations like NOAA and BOEM in the Bureau of Energy in the US are starting to use these. So I think there is, I haven't actually seen a terrestrial version of this, but I think this kind of thinking is where we should be at. And I think that if you're going to do monitoring, it should be to parameterize some of this modelling. So having a model of how you think your system works. You know, we all do modelling, even though you think you might not do. You need to know how you're going to get home. So you have a model of how you're going to get home, right? So we model the world, and these kind of models are just a way, they're parameterized mathematically, but it doesn't mean that they're useless or not viable. It's just that you have to start to put those together and then use your monitoring to validate that model and keep improving it. That's exactly what the climate people have done. And we're just so at the beginning. But I think with new AI tools, I think it's really an incredible time to start to think about this. We can scrape a lot of the information about how ecosystems work from the literature, from the published work that we've already got. So I think that that would be a really amazing opportunity to us to work together on how do we develop these types of models.
Sorry, brilliant. No, thank you so much for that. Absolutely, and maybe with biodiversity loss now a bit more on a level playing field with climate change in policy discourse, then maybe some more funding will flow to this important work. But it's great that we've, to get that. But now let's go to the front line. That's some of the science, and that's all very exciting. As a scientist, I'm thrilled to hear those summaries and that ray of hope there from UK. But like, what's, from your experiences of working with organisations grappling with the Task Force for Nature-related Financial Disclosure and related things, what are businesses actually doing? And what's working, what's not working? What are they grappling with? What's the bottleneck? Is this giant chasm between all this amazing science and then the realities of businesses managing supply chains? So another really easy question there.
Thank you. So I'm doing a bit of research at the moment, exploring the use of different biodiversity metrics in the TNFD disclosures, so the TNFD is basically a framework for business and finance to understand and report their impacts, dependencies, risks, and opportunities which are nature related. So it's quite a new framework. There are 14 core metrics which cover things like pollution, wastewater, water withdrawal, land use change, etc. And then they have 2 placeholder indicators for state of nature. So currently these are, as Andy would have chosen, species extinction risk and ecosystem integrity. But the TNFD is working with kind of various knowledge partners to decide whether these are sufficient, if we need more, etc. So when I started my research, I was really intrigued to know what state of nature measures businesses were actually reporting in their disclosures. So I had to read through some of them, 43 to be precise. Since the TNFD is a relatively new framework, businesses and the TNFD themselves are still learning and adapting. So I don't think it would be fair to judge these disclosures too harshly at this stage, because a lot of organisations are still kind of learning about biodiversity metrics and still gathering their data, which is a huge job if you think about multinationals having to document their supply chains, etc. But it was very striking just how much variation there is in the disclosures. They vary in like format, style, structure, level of detail, the metrics they use, the actual core indicators disclosed. So the TNFD guidance is quite clear that when you're doing your initial screening of your company, looking for which of your sites might be in a sensitive location, you should be looking at areas which are important for biodiversity, by which they really mean species, and areas important for ecosystem integrity. But of the organisations which do consider biodiversity, and these disclosures are voluntary, so you can kind of pick and choose which bits you work on. So those that do look at biodiversity, in the disclosures which I looked at, the most popular metric was proximity to protected areas. And then some companies also looking at proximity to key biodiversity areas, the number of threatened species overlapping their sites. Very few companies were looking at ecosystem integrity metrics. Although that said, again, very few of the disclosures report the methodology that they're using to identify these sites. A lot of them just report the final number of sites, which they say are in ecologically sensitive areas. So it's hard to know what metrics they might be using kind of behind the scenes. Other organisations do report metrics, but they don't necessarily seem to understand how to interpret them. Sometimes they might use 2 or more metrics that are based on the same underlying data set, so they're kind of causing themselves unnecessary complexity. And then if they're combining those metrics with like another metric as a kind of aggregate score, then they're biasing their results. Sometimes companies use bespoke metrics developed by consultancies, but with no explanation really as to what the metric is actually doing. Some companies use biodiversity indices such as Shannon Weiner and kind of reporting scores without really much context. So one disclosure literally read 143.5 species over 590 occurrences. So I'm not quite sure what they wanted to do with that. And then sometimes companies are using like a good metric, but maybe in the wrong context. So there was a bank that was using a metric of like global extinction risk, but they were using it on the UK. So all of the scores were very low and it was just uninformative for them. So I really felt quite sad for these companies because they're putting quite a lot of effort in, but the results were kind of a bit meaningless. But then on the other hand, some disclosures were like really pretty good. Like organizations were fully using like IBAT data, so incorporating star scores and then maybe adding in an aspect of ecosystem integrity such as BII or MSA. So overall, I think we can conclude that businesses, or some businesses, are happy to take on like a reasonable level of complexity. But what I think the real barrier for businesses is kind of navigating, understanding, and accessing the huge number and choice of metrics. So I've heard of businesses using terms like metric fatigue, metric soup. A recent review found over 600 different biodiversity metrics. And then you've got consultancies adding into that with their bespoke metrics, all selling their wares, saying their metrics the best. So it's really no wonder that businesses are confused. And I think that this kind of metric overwhelm is causing paralysis. So I think, yeah, businesses need really clear guidance on navigating these metrics. And whilst the TNFD has many, many guidance documents, they kind of have to be understandably metric agnostic. So since we as scientists can't agree, which metrics are the best ones, the TNFD really don't want to be promoting one metric over another. And also businesses have vastly different spatial footprints. So there needs to be a lot of flexibility in metric choice. So I think developing guidance for metric choice is really important. And then when supporting businesses to choose metrics, we also need to think about how to make disclosures meaningful, not just a box ticking exercise. So we don't want organizations to stop at disclosure, we want them to take action. And one way to do that, I think, to support them using metrics which include information about action as well as about the state of nature. So an example of this would be the STAR metric. So it gives you a score telling you the contribution of an area to global extinction risk, but it also gives you information on the threats which are driving that extinction risk. So an organisation is instantly kind of armed with information on what actions they could take to reduce extinction risk in their area of influence.
Thank you so much. I've got so many questions. I might just a little cheeky one about, so there's this figure about only 1% of businesses are including meaningful biodiversity information. So just, can you unpack that a little bit? And it's almost say, is it sort of 90% of the 1% just stopping at disclosure? Because the worry that I have now is that we're getting pretty good at developing tools to measure impacts, even if, as you say, there are some problems. But then what? And what's a good biodiversity metric that leads into sort of good place-based action? And from there, I mean, are there some examples? I know you can't name names in this sort of work, but did you come across some examples of where you thought this is really good and actually has the potential to shift the dial?
Yeah, I think there are some businesses which are doing really good disclosures. Like at IPBES last week, I met some, I do think, with my cynical hat on, that the businesses which are doing the best disclosures are also the ones sometimes with really bad environmental reputations. So I worry that maybe they're doing a good disclosure as a distraction from what they're doing. Hopefully not. But yeah, I mean, last week I met a business with a poor environmental reputation who are doing the most amazing work. So they're using the STAR metric, they've gone and they've ground truthed the metric, which is, the next stage, using all sorts of data. It was incredible. It could kind of be a whole PhD project, to be honest. So I think there is real scope for opportunity, and I think it's quite exciting thinking, businesses that get on board with this, what could be achieved if they're, collaborating with science.
And I get the sense there's quite a lot of sort of secret, brilliant work that's going on that businesses don't actually want to shout about because they worry that it's not good enough, but actually they're doing some pretty good things behind the scenes, or given the current geopolitics, it's best just to keep quiet about these things, but nonetheless there are some quite transformational things going on. It gives me a bit of hope. Is that? I'm hoping that's your sense too.
Yeah, I think one thing that was interesting reading these disclosures was that kind of the opposite of greenwashing, and some of them, where businesses had obviously been for decades working with local communities or restoring stuff, monitoring stuff, and they just kind of put it as a little aside in their disclosure. And I felt like, somebody needs to tell them that this is really important and they should be making a big deal of it in their disclosure. So it was really just such an interesting mix. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that insight. Right, so moving to governance, regulation, all these different metrics that are floating around. What's your sense of the types of metrics that are useful in terms of national reporting and regulatory landscapes? And where is the gap in terms of the science? So as a science community, what's your sort of steer on how we can make things much more usable for those governments that really want to take this seriously and do a good job?
Well, thank you very much, and it's nice to go last because I think we're picking up on pretty much the same themes here. So in terms of targets and metrics that are useful for reporting, I have a few thoughts. I guess the first is going back to, I think, what Kate really opened with was, what are you trying to achieve? And we do a lot of reporting. I'm fairly new in government, my predecessor's in the front row here. And I will say I was quite shocked coming in at the vast amount of reporting that is done, seemingly on the same things. And so I think we have to question whether the amount of reporting is actually helping us achieve our goals, or if it is ticking boxes, for one thing. Now, in terms of what are we actually trying to achieve, we have some really ambitious targets in the Environment Act on the same things that Andy mentioned, in terms of extinction risk, species abundance, and then tackling what is a driver, but also a part of the targets in terms of increasing wildlife-rich habitat. And these are not unambitious goals. They are ambitious goals with really ambitious timelines, certainly 2030 and then 2042. But I think the question that is really critical here is, what are we actually trying to achieve, and are these the right targets for what we want to achieve? Now, I would argue that what we want to achieve is healthy, resilient ecosystems. The targets that we have are the targets that we could measure in a straightforward way that is translatable across different groups. But I think we still have a pretty significant piece of work to do in terms of understanding if those targets actually get us to that goal, or whether we will end up in a state of recording decline and trying to preserve worlds that don't exist anymore. Because part of the problem, is, I'm sure we all appreciate, is that because of climate change, we are not going to hold things as they are now, and we're not going to recover ecosystems as they were when we grew up. So that is a really important aspect that has to be taken into account when we consider our outcomes and when we consider our targets, whether they are actually being realistic and reasonable and helping us get to healthy, resilient ecosystems, and not just chasing something that has long since become a fantasy. And that might be a bit harsh, but I think that is an important point to make. So then thinking about targets and how do we go from what we use right now in terms of species abundance and extinction risk to actually trying to achieve healthy, resilient ecosystems. And we are working on that. We've, obviously, lots of research teams are working on this. And actually, whenever I have this conversation over the last 6 months, whether it's here or at international meetings or with different academic groups or with devolved administrations, really everybody is moving in this direction. And that is really, really excellent to hear, because I think in the near term we might have a proliferation of approaches, but I think making sure that we are all joined up means that we will very quickly move towards a shared understanding of how we can best accomplish that. And I think the most important thing for us is that we do move towards that very quickly. And in fact, in the front row, somebody who I was discussing this with just last week, actually at IPBES, about how we need to be able to do things quicker than we might want to in the academic world, if we are actually going to be able to put things in place in time to actually have realistic, adaptive management of when we are trying to achieve this goal. And so we have to move probably faster than we're comfortable with, but and I think in order to do that, we need to work much more closely together across the entire community of academics, but also across really anybody else who's in this space. So that's kind of my first point in terms of outcomes and targets is really making sure they are outcomes focused and not just what we can measure and what we can do. The other kind of main point I really want to make is why haven't we made progress as much as we would have wanted to? Obviously, as I said, we have really ambitious targets. I think it's no secret that we aren't really on track for achieving them. Now, there's a few reasons for that. One is, to some extent, we probably don't have control over some of the drivers We have control over some of them, but not all of them, certainly. Climate change is obviously something that stretches beyond our borders. But as was pointed out in the IPBES assessment last week, one of the real issues is the siloing of different communities, different sectors. And I would say also different fields, even within my own department, it's fair to say that we have a siloing of, for example, agriculture and environment. We silo the marine from the terrestrial, the air from the water. And this is practical, but from somebody like myself who, in my kind of normal life as a scientist, thinks about complex interactions among different factors, having these things separated out probably makes our approach to intervening and mitigating and improving much less efficient. And I think it also makes it harder for others who want to come into this space to really understand what is the best way to act, because you're kind of picking things out individually as opposed to looking at the whole system. Now, people will argue, and people have, that complexity is complex. It makes it tricky for people to engage. I actually would argue that the oversimplification is making it hard to be effective. And there is a happy medium that we should try to achieve when we're looking at what metrics we use. And so that is where I think we very much have to put our efforts from across all sectors, really, to try and get to that point as quickly as possible. And so that's certainly what we're trying to do. And hopefully we will continue to and increasingly work together to do that. I think those are the main things that I wanted to kind of point out initially. I think the if I can make one more point, it is also that there's a huge amount of risk aversion in changing approach in this space. And I think we all feel that way, because I'm sure all of us are in this room because we are very inspired by nature, very devoted to protecting nature and improving the environment. And we feel like any changes could reduce our possibility of doing that. On the other hand, I think we also have to be aware of the fact that our approaches so far are falling short of our goals, and that we have to be willing to look hard at whether we're making the right actions if we want to make sure that we can actually be successful in achieving those outcomes.
Thank you so much. Really inspiring and thought-provoking interventions from all of you. We'll have a bit of a moderated discussion on some of the things that have emerged from that, and then we'll go over to the audience, because I know there are lots of incredible people in this audience who doubtless have things that they'd like to contribute to this discussion and questions. But something that hasn't yet come up, but that's very much in the forefront of my mind, is sort of the importance of place-based knowledge. And we know that indigenous communities in particular around the world are extraordinary stewards of Earth's biodiversity, and they are holders of knowledge systems that are adaptive, that are ancient, that are modern, that are very relevant to place. And yet it's not obviously, that knowledge isn't yet obviously showing up in the world, in the blizzard of metrics. So I don't know who wants to first have a stab at this. Various of you are nodding, and it's something I think we need to think about. Where are we at with all of that? I think we're almost certainly on the same page with the critical importance of that. Where are we at with it, and what more do we need to do as scientists to make that meaningful, so that it can meaningfully contribute to social and ecological resilience all over the world? Yep. Sure.
It's a great question, and I've got my view as a Western white middle-class male who's never lived outside the UK, so please do feel free to discount it. One of the things that started happening in ecology sort of 40-odd years ago was what became known as macroecology, the ignoring the differences among data and focusing on the commonalities, recognizing that it wasn't always a perfect fit, but that the aggregation had more power than the precision of lots of small separate bits. And that's been very, very beneficial, but that's also quite top down. And that's not the way that we're going to get this place-based, value in terms of how, because it's not only the information that's about nature that's local, but the management that works to sustain it that is local. If either side of this divide, to simplify it greatly, should be telling the other side what to do, it's they who should be telling us what to do, because we're the ones who got it wrong. And it's quite telling that power and wealth has become concentrated outside of IPLs, Indigenous peoples and local communities. And so life satisfaction is often higher among Indigenous peoples, not always, but where they have reasonable security of tenure, they're often higher. Longevity, less so, but life experience is good. Nature is on average more still there to a greater extent, and it's declining much more slowly in those indigenously managed and controlled lands than it is elsewhere. Outside of those areas, people are often, not always, less content, less satisfied, much less connected with nature, richer, more powerful, again, not all. It feels as though if the power could reside with the nature, then that would help. It definitely feels as though the kind of joining up of Indigenous and local knowledge that happened top down for macroecology needs to be bottom up. And this is something where I think new technologies could have a role to play, including things like federated learning, ways of not ceding data sovereignty, but it's still possible to have models that develop bottom up.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to? Yeah.
Sure. I think this is something that we think about actually quite a lot at the moment, both from the perspective of just kind of local interaction, but also thinking about Indigenous communities on the global scale. And I think there's a few things to point out. Well, one is that environmental governance tends to be, if not the most, it's certainly one of the most centralized aspects of government. And yet, the best way of engaging people with environmental issues is actually focusing on the local. Right? People care about what's around them. People care about their local environment. And it's much easier to explain why when you're not thinking about things that are very far away or just on a kind of more hypothetical or theoretical global scale. So I think working locally absolutely is the key to what we are trying to achieve here. Oh, is this one not working? Thanks. Well, hopefully you heard that. Local, basically what I said. In terms of Indigenous communities in particular, I think we, as a scientific community, have hugely discounted the kinds of knowledge that Indigenous communities have. I think we still kind of struggle to call it data because it's not necessarily replicated, isn't gathered in the same way that we kind of set up our experiments or set up our data. And yet, we're also, as we've discussed, struggling with a temporal lag in our ability to identify whether we are achieving outcomes, whether change is happening. And yet, Indigenous communities are so far ahead in identifying this. And if we could, I think, be more humble and actually incorporate knowledge that was not gathered in the kind of way that we usually prefer, then we would be far more able to achieve our outcomes. So I think part of that is about the scientific community genuinely learning how to respect data coming out of Indigenous communities and different kinds of knowledge capture. And then how we actually incorporate that more into how we assess and monitor and improve the environment. I think a federated approach is certainly one that makes a lot of sense. I think we are losing huge amounts of data at the moment because we haven't done that and because we are tangling with that ownership issue, but also a respect issue. And so I think that is the crux of what we need to solve, but we absolutely have to if we want to be able to be responsive.
So bearing that in mind, is the panel sort of optimistic about the Kali Fund? I mean, that's one possible mechanism that was established in Colombia at the last CBD COP. Perhaps quite relevant to you, Mark, and your work. I don't know whether you want to reflect on that.
Yeah, so if people don't know, this is the idea that the idea of local communities and sovereign nations sharing their biodiversity with the world in a kind of access and benefit sharing. So they'll give access to the rest of the world, but when do they get the benefit? And at the moment, the benefit is a bit like a lottery. Maybe the fungus that was sequenced from the rotting log in your forest turns out to have a blockbuster drug in it. Maybe. And that comes in 20 years' time. By that time, the forest has gone. So the idea is to build a fund that pays back now, so that users what expected a future income from the value we place on this biodiversity knowledge, and is paid back now, so that the local communities and sovereign nations can use that to protect their biodiversity or to build their own bioeconomies or whatever they choose to do. So I think that is the only way. For example, in biodiversity genomics, we will get to sequence all life on this planet. You mentioned a number of $4 billion is spent a year on climate change modeling. $4 billion is what is needed to sequence every species on this planet. So the numbers are actually frighteningly small. $4 billion is what we spent sequencing the human genome first time round. So it's actually an extraordinarily cheap, I don't have $4 billion, it's an extraordinarily cheap project to get genomic information on everything on this planet. The International Barcode of Life has this mission to planet Earth, and they projected it only costs $300 million to actually get eDNA, environmental DNA and water DNA and air DNA sampling of DNA barcodes of species across the planet in tens of thousands of sites. So these are tiny amounts of money, and that's something that having a fund which we, who are already profiting from centuries of colonialism and extractive approaches to biodiversity, can put back in, so that the future of these ecosystems is assured.
And do you think that it's voluntary at the moment, isn't it? Do you think this should be mandatory?
I think it should be mandatory. I have a small amount of power. But yes, at the moment it's a voluntary fund where you get kudos and points on karma for doing it rather than anything else.
And just briefly, Elizabeth, is it showing up at all in the TNFD? Place-based knowledge, indigenous wisdom, is that emerging in that space?
So the TNFD are quite clear that you should be considering it, and they do have, I did check, they have a 50 plus page guidance document on it, but you don't see very many examples really beyond, you kind of get a point for developing a policy for engagement with IPRC. So companies seem to be doing that, which I think you can view as anything from a good start through to a total pop-out, depending on your optimism versus cynicism. Yeah, I don't know.
Thank you. So now I'd like to, the hand straight up there on the front row. Wonderful. That's made my job very easy to go to questions to you all. Please, let's start with you in the front row. And just give your name and your institution if you'd like. Oh yes, I think there might be one coming. Yeah, there's one coming. Yeah, you're going to be doing a lot of running around, Chris. I hope you're ready.
Thank you. Very fascinating. My name's Barbara Williams, and I'm an expert on socio-economic shift, which is well underway at the moment. I would like to suggest that there's a much easier way to measure biodiversity, because we have an ecocidal economic model at the moment. If we change the economic model from growth to shrinking GDP, shrinking population, until we return to the carrying capacity of Earth, it's a much easier, and we know how to measure GDP. All we need to do is to measure reduction in GDP rather than growth in GDP and reduction in population.
Okay, thank you very much, Barbara. Yes, changing the economic model, that's at the root cause of all of this. I think there are many people working on that and who would agree with you. Do you want to make a comment on that, Andy? You can see.
I just want to come in briefly. 2 points. One is that you can reduce GDP without doing a lot of good as well. But on population is one of the reasons that we're using the Earth unsustainably, but it's also consumption. it's overconsumption. And so if we all consumed, so probably everybody, because you are here, we're all in the top 10% of consumers in terms of our kind of personal ecological footprint. And if everybody consumed at the median level, we'd be able to cope with twice as many people as we have now globally. Okay.
This is a tension that's oft debated. It's very, very important. I think we need growth of well-being. We need growth of love in the world. Let's focus on that. And there are many countries and communities that are actually realistically experimenting with different growth models that centre well-being over monetary value.
Has been running for 100 years.
Yeah.
And when it started, we were a quarter of the size that we are now.
Yeah.
How can you claim that twice as many can survive when we've been damaging the environment for 100
Let's take this debate to afterwards. But absolutely, thank you for raising it, Barbara. I'm not closing you down, but lots of people want to ask questions. But that's great, Gideon. You.
Thanks very much. I'm Gideon Henderson, a professor here at the Earth Science Department. The phrase nature positive is used quite a lot in policy circles in international discourse. Is it a useful phrase? And can we agree on what nature positive means in a meaningful way?
Love it. It's another big, potentially a buzzword, isn't it, that needs unpacking. Thanks for the question. Any?
We do have something from the Nature Positive Initiative.
Do we do? Would somebody from the Nature Positive Initiative like to speak to this? Sorry to put you on.
Last week, so.
Yeah, as long as you don't mind. Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. Wonderful. Thanks.
Great. That's a great question. Yes, there is a consensus definition on what nature positive means. It has been co-opted a bit more by the private sector community, but essentially is toward the mission of the Global Biodiversity Framework to halt and reverse biodiversity loss using a 2020 baseline to align with the policy framework toward full recovery by 2050. So,
amazing. Thank you.
Follow up on that. Sorry, I think it's being recorded, so I better wait. One of the flavours of the conversation was that we're in an overwhelming number of metrics, metric soup, metric fatigue. The way that we actually measure nature positive must in some way reflect things that we can measure, so metrics. So and to me it seems like a term that although there's a form of words that means something, it doesn't actually link us to the biodiversity on the floor. So I'd be interested to know the views of this expert panel about is nature positive a useful expression.
Thank you, Gideon. Yeah.
That is the flavor of the conversation that we had last week, actually, is are we just layering on words or actual metrics? And if we are creating metrics, are we also just layering on additional complexity that doesn't actually add much? But we did have a good conversation about that. No, Andy.
So I mentioned earlier, I think there's a minimum of 2 dimensions, and I recognise a third one is the nature as culture, the sense of place. Is it able to sustain what you need? So if we have a small number of main dimensions, then an action's nature positive if the expected result of doing that action improves at least one of those and doesn't make any of them worse. Because they're not in currencies that can be exchanged. So you can't trade them off and still say it's nature positive. It's positive in some dimensions, negative in others. But if it's only positive or neutral, then compared with a counterfactual where the action doesn't take place. Now it has to be expected based on a model, because otherwise you take an action, it's doing good, but the trend is still downwards for reasons beyond the control of the actor. Well, they shouldn't be penalised for that. So it has to be based on a model, and it has to be global to avoid leakage, just simply shutting down an activity locally and moving it over there. So you have to look at the global picture. But I think that you can have a meaningful definition of nature positive.
Thank you. Thanks for that clarity. Did you want to come in, Liz? I can see. Yeah, of course.
Thanks. Sorry, just kind of speaking for Rachel here, really. But the Nature Positive Initiative, have been working on these dimensions over the last year, and the results of their piloting framework are out for comment tomorrow. So I would urge everybody that has an opinion on this to have a look and give their feedback.
thank you for that. That's really everyone's diving in now. Do you want to say something briefly, and then we'll go to another question?
Yeah, I guess to Gideon's point, it is meaningless without the thing you actually want to achieve and the intervention that you want to do. So it is, I think there is a cultural aspect of that and a political aspect of that, which is about, you know, positive news and nature positive, and we want to do something, and a place-based action is really important. But then I come back to what is it we're trying to achieve, and I think that's got to be much more front and centre in the way that we're doing this, else we're not going to get there because we haven't said where we want to go. So we have all the metrics in the world, but unless we have the things that we're supposed to, an actual goal, it's very tricky.
Yeah, we need a map and a compass, don't we? Yeah.
Okay,
go for it.
I do slightly disagree with that. I mean, I think we can have goals, right? Those who are, you know, really actively working in the area. But I think for everybody else in the world, maybe that not everybody has to have that clarity in terms of their goals. Maybe just having a sense for whether what they're doing has a negative impact or is a positive impact without negatively impacting other things is a useful thing for people to be able to act on and make decisions on, because otherwise I think people are overwhelmed, as we've talked about, overwhelmed with the metrics, overwhelmed with the complexity. And so giving people something that clarifies that you are on the, you're doing something in the right direction as opposed to the wrong direction, without necessarily saying, and here's a larger thing that you're trying to achieve. What you're trying to achieve is not having a negative impact on nature, right? And maybe at some level, not for, I think, government, and not for big businesses maybe necessarily, but I think, I think on the smaller scale, that is a useful thing at some level. And I think that also helps put this in the context of not just thinking about nature as a separate thing, but having it better embedded within all the other structures that depend on it. So obviously we're talking about the economy mainly, but we also need to think about it in terms of national security, in terms of health, all these other elements that are entirely dependent on a healthy environment. So I think having some measure of whether you're moving in the right direction with actions is helpful for making it better embedded within all those other systems, as opposed to this separate thing that feels like a nice to have in many conversations.
Thank you, thanks for that. And certainly the IPBES summary that came out really underscores that, and the IPBES Nexus assessment and the values assessment, very, very much clear on all of that. Yeah, and in a storm of metrics, you need a values-based compass, I think, and that's going to be very, very place-based. Questions? Did you have one? Yeah, Cecile?
Oh,
yeah, sure, yeah. No, you can.
I'll grab that. Hi,
Cecile and then Tom for a double question.
Okay, we'll do a double. I'm Cécile Girardin. I work with NAT on Nature-Based Solutions Initiative and on a spin-out social venture that we set up called Nature-Based Insights that helps businesses navigate all this with scientific integrity. And I have a question for Kate. I was wondering, well, you said that TNFD can't support metrics. I get that, but I was wondering if, so we have the IPBES assessment now, and I'm wondering if the IPBES assessment does review metrics in a way that's useful to businesses, and that's useful to businesses, and then we also have coming up the Nature Positive Initiative Biodiversity Monitoring Protocol. I'm sure you've heard of that one, and I'm wondering what you think of that, and if we should be hopeful about getting clarity and consensus on metrics from those two documents.
Yeah, so I think that the monitoring protocol is going to be really, really important. It's really important that we kind of get it right, so that, I think, it's difficult, isn't it? I think having a standardized framework, I guess it just gives that kind of level of comparability, so that, I guess, if you're an investor and you want to compare companies, you sort of got a framework. I guess it gives structure as well. So I think these frameworks are important. Yeah, sorry, it's not great.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to change tack slightly now, because I've remembered that this is a thing at these events, isn't it? You take clusters of questions in order to make sure that we hear as many as possible. So Tom, I know you had a question, so microphone back to Tom. So to take a question from Tom, and then a couple of other people, and then you can, on the panel, choose which you'd like to answer. So please.
Thank you. So I'm Tom Evans from the Wildlife Conservation Society. We've heard that businesses are not doing a great job yet of measuring the totality of their impacts on nature, but one subset that they should be looking at is their impacts on the aspects of nature that they themselves are dependent upon. That should be within everybody's business case. You'd imagine there at least we might be making some progress. Are we? And are scientists helping them to join those dots with useful metrics?
Okay, that's a brilliant question. Thank you. If we can hold that in our minds. And then should we have an online question, a couple of online questions? Hello, online audience. Sorry for ignoring you so far.
We have some great questions online. Some are long essays, and forgive me for not reading them out. A particular question for Anjali and also Elizabeth. There's a lot of many reviews going on for the water sector at the moment, including the Cunliffe review. Do you think that the activity in this area can be mobilised for nature-positive solutions?
Okay, great. Both of those are quite meaty questions, so let's just be kind to the panel and just stick with the two for now. Any takers for Tom's question? Do you want to? Yeah.
So that's a really good point that like businesses depend on nature. So I think from what I've seen of reviews, like water actually, which ties in with the other question, is maybe businesses are doing better on disclosing it, because I guess it might just be that I don't understand water. So I'm like, oh, they've done a really good disclosure because I don't understand it. But it does look like more businesses are disclosing on water, and I guess it's a very obvious dependency. And I guess my hope is that if you're working on wetlands, etc., to make your water supply sustainable, hopefully you're helping biodiversity at the same time.
Yes.
I've been talking to the dairy farmers, and they're really concerned about soil, and they've made the link between soil health and their product. And I think I was at a leadership forum a couple of weeks ago, and I was kind of shocked how far behind they are in terms of monitoring and understanding the frameworks to monitor. But I think there is a lot of enthusiasm for doing so. So I think the problem is those links between their product and nature. I don't think that has been made a strong enough case for, and I think that is changing.
Thank you. Thank you, Kate. And the online question?
Yes, I think is my answer. That absolutely, there's huge opportunities for the reform that's happening or planned to happen in the water sector to also drive better environmental outcomes, and that is actually one of the main areas of concern within that. So what I'm really focusing on, and this goes back to in some ways monitoring, is actually having all those systems joined up. So when we're collecting information about water quality, water treatment, and obviously all of the things that intersect with that, that we are looking at that also from the perspective of gathering data that will help us achieve our biodiversity and other environmental targets at the same time. So I think that is very much an opportunity to do that. And I think going forward, as I said, there is a move to break down silos, I think, across government, across departments, and this is, I think, a really good example of that.
Thank you. It's closing. Okay, great. Possible for one more question? One more question, okay. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Greg Schwartz. I'm a visiting environmental geography professor. I've helped a bit here with Oxford Net Zero. My question is this: we have so much skill and wisdom and knowledge up here, obviously, and you represent the scientific community, and it's sort of an age-old question of, how do we translate that to create behavioral change? And that's somewhat obvious, I guess. We have, I guess, The Guardian and the New York Times, which sort of condense and present these ideas to the general public, because they're not going to necessarily read all the scientific papers. That's an ongoing challenge. But in my mind, and that's a pillar, because we have to change behavior, but also we have to reach, C-suite corporate level and the financial sector, because we're talking about, $4 billion is all we need to sequence the entire planet, and the US military budget is $700 billion. I mean, we have the money if we just redistribute it. And so we get it from the financial sector, but they speak different languages than we all do here, and they're having a financial, seminar right now, and we're in here. And so in your minds, where is that bridge? Is it 3 martini lunches? Is it you all giving, talks in their corporate boardrooms? Where is that synthesis? Where does that come together? Where do all this knowledge translate to them? And so the light bulb goes on and they say, we need to fund this. Obviously, that's a big question.
It's a huge question, and I'm sure there's many people, some people in this audience actually actively working on that very point. But does our panel have any comments? Okay, sure.
Yeah, it's a great question. So, not 4 billion, but the indicator that my lab produces, Biodiversity and Tackness Index, we've been working with Bloomberg. We were approached by them because they wanted to have an indicator that they could serve to subscribers to their terminal service, of whom there are over 350,000 now, mainly investment professionals. So this is, ours was the first biodiversity data to be, I think it's the only biodiversity data, but we worked with them quite closely so that they were putting in their part of the hard yards in terms of working out how to take the indicator data and the trends, turning them into information that investment decision makers wanted to be able to look at. And lots of iteration. The point was made earlier, I think you made it, Lizzie, that sometimes people are not understanding what it is they've used. I was super impressed by the team at Bloomberg with the care they took to make sure that they were getting it straight, and that the simplifying cuts they were making brought clarity rather than ironing out the big differences. And they take data on a license from us, and the license fee helps the museum to actually fund the production and the improvement of the indicators. So at a very small scale, we've kind of got a proof of concept. And a lot of companies, the ESG side of them, they're super sophisticated and also very good intention. Sorry,
I think we're all overrunning. We're going to have to take this conversation informally. So thank you so much, very much, to our amazing speakers for their fantastic insights and inspiration. Lots and lots of food for thought, lots of unanswered questions and new frontiers, but also some hope, I think. Thank you all very much for joining us, and online as well.